For 30 years, China had a spy inside the CIA, not in a basement safehouse, not hidden in the shadows. Right there, at a desk, translating America's most sensitive intelligence on China, passing it back to Beijing with every breath, and nobody noticed. His name was Larry Wu-Tai Chin, a quiet man, a naturalized U.S. citizen, a father, a civil servant who showed up to work on time, did his job, and went home. The FBI never suspected him. His colleagues never doubted him. For 3 decades, he lived 2 lives so perfectly balanced that even when the truth finally came out, some people still couldn't believe it. But what the declassified files reveal is far more disturbing than a simple case of espionage. Because Larry didn't see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as a patriot. And the choice he made in 1948, the one that set everything in motion, wasn't about money, or ideology, or revenge. It was about loyalty. But loyalty to which country? And when you serve 2 nations at once, can you ever truly belong to either? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers all over the world who share this passion for the hidden stories of the Cold War. And if you want more deep dives into the moral dilemmas, the buried truths, and the human cost of the shadow wars that shaped our world, hit subscribe. Every day we uncover another story they didn't teach you in school. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a young translator in wartime China, to a choice made in secret, and to the 30 years of silence that followed. This is the story of Larry Wu-Tai Chin. The story begins not in Washington, but in Beijing. In 1922, when Larry Wu-Tai Chin was born, China was a nation caught in the grip of chaos. The Qing dynasty had collapsed a decade earlier, leaving behind a power vacuum that warlords, foreign powers, and revolutionary movements all rushed to fill. China was neither fully sovereign nor fully colonized. It was a country fractured, humiliated, and searching desperately for a path forward. Larry's family was modest, but educated. They valued learning, discipline, and quiet dignity in a world that seemed to reward only violence and opportunism. His father worked as a low-level official, navigating the shifting tides of power with caution. His mother taught him Confucian values, loyalty, respect, filial piety. But above all, she taught him something that would define the rest of his life, that a man's first duty is to his homeland, no matter where life takes him. By the time Larry was a teenager, China was at war. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion. Cities burned, villages were massacred, millions fled. And Larry, like so many young Chinese men of his generation, found himself swept into the machinery of war, not as a soldier, but as something more subtle, more useful. He was good with languages, English especially. He had a natural ear for it, a precision that made him valuable in a world where communication across cultures could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In 1943, at the height of World War II, American forces needed translators in China. The U.S. Army Liaison Office was hiring. Larry applied. He was accepted. For the next several years, Larry worked alongside American officers, translating intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and enemy documents. He was efficient, reliable, and unremarkable in the best possible way. The Americans trusted him. They had no reason not to. He was on their side after all, or so it seemed. But even as Larry translated for the Americans, he was watching, listening, learning. He saw how the United States viewed China, not as a partner, but as a piece on a global chessboard. He saw how American policy favored the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, even as corruption and incompetence bled the nationalist cause dry. And he saw in the distance the rise of Mao Zedong's communist forces, disciplined, ideological, and absolutely convinced that they represented China's future. In 1948, as the Chinese Civil War reached its final brutal stage, Larry made a choice. It was not a choice made in haste, and it was not a choice made lightly. An officer from the Communist Party's intelligence apparatus approached him. The conversation was brief. The offer was clear. Serve the new China. Help protect it from foreign powers. You are already inside the American system. Stay there. Be our eyes. Larry said yes. He didn't see it as betrayal. Not then. Not ever, really. He saw it as loyalty to his homeland, to the revolution, to a vision of China rising from centuries of humiliation at the hands of foreign empires. He believed, as many Chinese patriots did in those years, that the communist victory was not just political, but moral, that Mao's forces represented the will of the people, the restoration of Chinese dignity, the end of a long nightmare. And so, Larry Wu-Tai Chin became a spy, not for money, not for abstract ideology, but for a nation he still called home, even as he prepared to build a life thousands of miles away. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was declared. The nationalists fled to Taiwan. The Americans, stunned by the loss of their ally, scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. And Larry, quietly, began his work. In 1952, Larry emigrated to the United States. He settled in California, then later moved to the Washington, D.C. area. He married an American woman. He raised a family. He became a naturalized U.S. citizen. He attended neighborhood barbecues, paid his taxes, and blended seamlessly into the fabric of suburban American life. And in 1952, he was hired by the Central Intelligence Agency. He wasn't a field operative. He wasn't a handler or a case officer. His job was far more mundane and far more valuable. He worked for the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, a division of the CIA tasked with monitoring, translating, and analyzing foreign media and communications, specifically communications from China. It was the perfect position. Larry had access to classified intelligence assessments, diplomatic cables, military analyses, and reports on Chinese leadership. He knew what the CIA knew about China. He understood how American intelligence interpreted Beijing's moves, what they feared, what they misunderstood, and what they planned to do next. And every few months, quietly, carefully, Larry would pass that knowledge back to Beijing. He didn't use dead drops in parks or secret radios hidden in his basement. His methods were simpler, safer. He would travel to Hong Kong, to Toronto, cities where Chinese intelligence operated openly under diplomatic cover. He would meet his handlers in crowded restaurants, in hotel lobbies, in parks filled with tourists. He would pass documents in sealed envelopes. He would receive instructions, encouragement, and modest payments. Never large sums, but enough to signal respect, enough to show that Beijing valued his work. And then he would return home, kiss his wife, help his children with their homework, go back to work on Monday morning as if nothing had happened. For 30 years, Larry Wu-Tai Chin maintained this double life with near-perfect discipline. He didn't flaunt wealth. He didn't socialize with foreign diplomats. He didn't fit any profile the FBI used to identify spies. He was simply a competent, unremarkable civil servant who came to work on time, did his job well, and went home. The CIA never suspected him. His colleagues never doubted him, and China quietly considered him one of their most valuable assets in the United States until 1985. The unraveling began not in Washington, but in Beijing. And it began, as so many intelligence failures do, with a single act of betrayal. In the early 1980s, a senior Chinese intelligence officer named Yu Zhensan made a decision that would change everything. Yu had spent decades in China's foreign intelligence apparatus, rising through the ranks, earning trust, gaining access to some of the most closely guarded secrets in Beijing's espionage network. He knew names, he knew operations, he knew methods, cover identities, and communication protocols. He was, in the language of intelligence work, a goldmine, and in 1985, Yu Zhensan defected to the United States. The reasons for his defection remain murky even today. Some say he was disillusioned with the Communist Party. Others suggest he feared he was about to be purged in one of Beijing's periodic internal security sweeps. Still others believe he simply wanted a better life for his family. far from the paranoia and surveillance that defined existence inside China's intelligence community. Whatever his motivations, Yu brought with him a trove of information that sent shockwaves through both the CIA and the FBI. He provided details on Chinese intelligence operations across Asia, Europe, and North America. He exposed networks that had operated undetected for years, and among the many secrets he shared was a reference to a long-term asset inside U.S. intelligence, someone who had been reporting to Beijing for decades, someone the Chinese considered invaluable. The CIA and FBI launched a joint investigation immediately. They began with the obvious question: who had access to the kind of information you described? The answer was troubling. Hundreds of people, potentially. The CIA employed thousands of analysts, translators, and support staff, many of whom handled classified material every day. But Yu had provided clues. The asset, he said, worked in analysis, not operations. The asset had been in place since at least the 1950s. The asset had regular access to intelligence assessments on China, diplomatic, military, political. And the asset traveled frequently, often to Hong Kong and other cities where Chinese intelligence maintained a presence. The investigators began cross-referencing names, reviewing personnel files, tracing travel records, and analyzing patterns. The list narrowed, and eventually, slowly, inevitably, it led to Larry Wu-Tai Chin. At first, the evidence was circumstantial. Larry had worked for the CIA since 1952. He had access to exactly the kind of material you described. He had made numerous trips to Hong Kong over the years, often claiming they were personal visits to see relatives or conduct business. But when investigators dug deeper, they found something troubling. Larry had no relatives in Hong Kong, and the business he claimed to conduct there had no verifiable records. The FBI began surveillance. They watched his movements, monitored his phone calls, tracked his finances. They were careful, methodical, patient. They didn't want to spook him. They wanted to understand the full scope of what he had done, what he had given away, and whether there were others. What they discovered was both shocking and, in a strange way, almost mundane. Larry wasn't living like a spy. He wasn't driving expensive cars or wearing tailored suits. He wasn't meeting shadowy figures in dark alleyways. His life looked entirely ordinary, a comfortable middle-class existence in suburban Virginia, nothing more. But the travel records told a different story. Between 1952 and 1985, Larry had made dozens of trips to Hong Kong and Toronto. The FBI traced his movements during those trips and found something damning. Larry would arrive, check into a modest hotel, and then, within 24 hours, he would meet with individuals the FBI had already identified as Chinese intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. The meetings followed a pattern. They took place in public spaces, restaurants, parks, shopping districts. Larry and his handlers would sit together for 20 or 30 minutes, sometimes less. They would talk quietly. Larry would pass an envelope or a folder. The handler would nod, stand, and leave. Then Larry would finish his meal, or his walk, and return to his hotel as if nothing had happened. The FBI photographed these meetings. They documented the dates, the locations, the individuals involved. They tracked the payments Larry received, modest deposits into his bank account, never large enough to attract immediate attention, but consistent, regular, and always shortly after his return from Hong Kong or Toronto. By the summer of 1985, the FBI had enough. They knew Larry Wu-Tai Chin was a spy. They knew he had been passing classified information to China for decades. They knew the methods he used, the handlers he met, and the payments he received. But they still didn't know the full extent of the damage. They didn't know exactly what he had given away, or whether he had helped recruit others, or whether there were additional assets still operating inside the CIA. So they waited, and they watched, and they prepared. In November 1985, the FBI made its move. On a gray, cold morning, 2 agents knocked on Larry's door in Alexandria, Virginia. They were polite, professional. They asked if they could come in. Larry, standing in the doorway in his bathrobe, looked at them for a long moment, and then he stepped aside and let them in. He knew, after 30 years of silence, after thousands of documents passed in secret, after a lifetime of living two lives with near-perfect discipline, he knew the game was over. The knock at the door had finally come, and Larry Wu-Tai Chin, for the first time in 3 decades, was about to speak the truth. The FBI brought Larry to a secure facility in Northern Virginia. It was a windowless room, sterile and quiet, the kind of place designed to strip away all distraction, all pretense, all hope of escape. There was a table, a few chairs, a recording device, and 2 agents who had spent months learning every detail of Larry's life. They laid out the evidence methodically, travel records showing dozens of trips to Hong Kong and Toronto over 3 decades, bank statements revealing modest but consistent deposits following each trip, surveillance photographs showing Larry sitting across from known Chinese intelligence officers in restaurants and parks, testimony from Yu Zhensan, the defector who had confirmed that someone matching Larry's profile had been operating inside the CIA since the early 1950s. Larry sat quietly, hands folded on the table, his face expressionless. He was 63 years old. He had spent more than half his life carrying a secret that no one, not his wife, not his children, not his closest colleagues, had ever suspected. And now, in this cold, silent room, the secret was laid bare before him. The agents asked their first question. Did he know why he was there? Larry nodded slowly. Yes, he said. He knew. Had he passed classified information to the People's Republic of China? Larry looked at the agents for a long moment. Then he said simply, yes. The agents pressed forward. How long? Since when? Since 1948, Larry said. Even before he joined the CIA, he had been approached by Chinese intelligence while still working as a translator for the U.S. Army in China. They had asked him to continue his work, to stay inside the American system, to help the new China understand what was being said about them. And he had agreed. Why? The agents asked. Why would you betray your country? Larry's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not defiance, but something closer to sadness. I did not betray my country, he said quietly. I served it. China is my country. I was born there. My ancestors are buried there. The United States gave me a job, gave me citizenship, gave me a comfortable life. But China is my homeland. That never changed. The agents asked him to describe what he had done. What information had he passed? How much damage had he caused? Larry answered carefully, precisely, the same way he had done everything in his life. He had provided translations of classified intelligence assessments. He had shared diplomatic reports on U.S.-China relations. He had passed along military analyses, evaluations of Chinese leadership, and strategic assessments prepared by CIA analysts. He had given Beijing a window into American thinking. Not weapons blueprints, not field agent identities, not nuclear secrets, but context, interpretation, strategy. In his mind, he had not stolen anything that would directly harm the United States. He had simply told China what America thought of them, and in his moral calculus that was not treason. It was information that China had a right to know, information that could prevent misunderstandings, miscalculations, and perhaps even war. But the law, of course, saw it very differently. The agents asked about the money. Over the years, Larry had received payments totaling more than $180,000 from Chinese intelligence. That was a significant sum, they said. If this wasn't about money, why did he accept it? Larry paused. They offered it, he said. I didn't ask for it, but I accepted it because refusing would have been insulting. In Chinese culture, you cannot refuse a gift from someone you respect. It would suggest you don't value the relationship. The money wasn't the reason I did this, but I couldn't turn it away without offending them. The interrogation continued for hours. The agents wanted names, other spies, other assets, other operatives Larry might have worked with, but Larry insisted he had always worked alone. He had never recruited anyone. He had never been part of a network. He was a lone actor, serving his conscience and his homeland, operating in the shadows for 3 decades without ever exposing anyone else to risk. The agents didn't entirely believe him. Spies, in their experience, rarely work in complete isolation, but they couldn't break his story. Larry was calm, consistent, and utterly unmoved by their pressure. He had already accepted what was coming. He had accepted it the moment he opened his door that November morning. Finally, the agents asked him one last question. Did he regret what he had done? Larry looked at them for a long time. Then he said, "I regret that I was caught. I regret the pain this will cause my family. But I do not regret serving China. I did what I believed was right, and I would do it again." The room fell silent. The agents closed their files. They informed Larry that he was under arrest. The charges would be conspiracy, espionage, and fraud. He would face trial in federal court. If convicted, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Larry nodded. He stood slowly as the agents prepared to take him into custody. He didn't resist. He didn't protest. He had known this moment would come eventually. And now that it had, all he felt was a strange, quiet sense of relief. After 30 years of living 2 lives, Larry Wu-Tai Chin finally had only one. The trial of Larry Wu-Tai Chin began in February 1986 in a federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. The courtroom was packed with reporters, intelligence officials, and curious onlookers who had come to see the man who had deceived the CIA for 30 years. Outside, television crews set up their cameras, and newspapers across the country ran headlines that mixed shock with disbelief. CIA translator spied for China since 1952. The spy who hid in plain sight. Betrayal from within. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was quieter, more somber. This was not a Hollywood espionage thriller. There were no car chases, no shootouts, no dramatic escapes. This was the trial of a 63-year-old civil servant who had lived an ordinary life while committing what the government called one of the longest-running espionage operations in American history. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented the travel records, the bank statements, the surveillance photographs. They called FBI agents to the stand who described the investigation, the evidence they had gathered, and the interrogation in which Larry had admitted everything. They presented testimony from Yu Zhensan, the Chinese defector, who confirmed that Larry had been one of Beijing's most valuable assets in the United States, a source so reliable, so well-placed, that Chinese intelligence had protected his identity even from other operatives. The prosecutors laid out the timeline of Larry's espionage with meticulous detail. From 1952 to 1985, they said, Larry Wu-Tai Chin had passed hundreds of classified documents to Chinese intelligence. He had met with handlers in at least 3 countries. He had accepted payments totaling over $180,000, and he had done all of this while holding a position of trust inside the Central Intelligence Agency, an institution tasked with protecting American national security. The damage, they argued, was incalculable. Larry had given China insights into how the United States viewed Chinese leadership, military capabilities, and diplomatic intentions. He had revealed what the CIA knew, what it didn't know, and where its blind spots were. He had allowed Beijing to calibrate its responses, to anticipate American moves, and to operate with a level of strategic confidence that would have been impossible without inside information. Every document Larry passed, the prosecutors said, was an act of betrayal. Every meeting with a handler was a violation of his oath as a U.S. citizen. Every dollar he accepted was proof that this was not some abstract ideological commitment, but a calculated, sustained, and profitable relationship with a hostile foreign power. The defense had a much harder task. Larry's attorney, a seasoned public defender named Robert Blossfeld, did not deny the facts. He couldn't. Larry had admitted to everything. Instead, Blossfeld focused on intent, on motive, on the question of what kind of man Larry Wu-Tai Chin really was. He painted a portrait of a man caught between two worlds, two loyalties, two definitions of honor. Larry, Blossfeld argued, was not a mercenary. He was not a traitor in the conventional sense. He was a Chinese patriot who had never stopped loving his homeland, even after becoming an American citizen. He genuinely believed that by helping China understand American thinking, he was preventing misunderstandings and reducing the risk of conflict. Blossfeld called character witnesses, colleagues who described Larry as hardworking, honest, and kind, neighbors who remembered him as a good father and a quiet, respectful man. He emphasized that Larry had never passed information that directly endangered American lives. He had not revealed the names of field agents. He had not stolen weapons technology or military secrets. He had simply provided analysis, context, and interpretation. Was it illegal? Yes. Was it espionage? Technically, yes. But was it the act of a man who wanted to harm the United States? Blossfeld argued it was not. Larry Wu-Tai Chin, he said, was a man who believed he was serving a higher moral purpose, protecting his ancestral homeland from what he saw as American aggression and misunderstanding. But the jury was not persuaded. They deliberated for less than a day. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The judge, the Honorable T.S. Ellis III, addressed Larry directly before sentencing. He acknowledged that Larry's case was unusual, that his motives were perhaps more complex than those of a typical spy. But the law, the judge said, does not bend for complexity. The law is clear. Larry Wu-Tai Chin had committed espionage against the United States of America. He had violated his oath, betrayed his colleagues, and placed American interests at risk for more than 3 decades. The sentence was life in prison. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Larry stood, his face expressionless, his hands at his sides. He did not cry. He did not plead. He simply nodded once as if acknowledging a fact he had always known would come to pass. The bailiffs moved forward to take him into custody. Larry turned briefly, looking back at his family seated in the gallery. His wife sat with her hands covering her face. His children stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. And then Larry Wu-Tai Chin was led away, handcuffed through a side door, into the machinery of the American prison system. The trial was over. The truth was public. The life he had built in the shadows had finally collapsed into the light. But the story was not finished yet. Larry Wu-Tai Chin was transferred to the Fairfax County Detention Center to await his formal sentencing hearing. He was placed in a cell with minimal furnishings, a bed, a toilet, a small desk. The walls were cinder block, painted a pale institutional gray. There was a single window, narrow and reinforced with wire mesh, through which he could see a sliver of sky. For the first time in 30 years, Larry had nothing to do, no documents to translate, no intelligence to analyze, no secret meetings to prepare for. He was simply alone with his thoughts, with the weight of what he had done, and with the certainty of what lay ahead. Prison guards later reported that Larry was quiet, polite, and compliant. He ate his meals without complaint. He spoke respectfully to the staff. He showed no signs of distress, no outbursts of anger or despair. To the outside observer, he appeared resigned, perhaps even at peace. But inside, something else was happening. On the evening of February 21st, 1986, just days after his conviction, Larry sat at the small desk in his cell and wrote a brief note. The contents of that note have never been made public, but those who saw it described it as simple, matter-of-fact, almost businesslike. He addressed a few practical matters. He expressed regret for the pain his actions had caused his family, and then he set the note aside. He took a plastic garbage bag from the small trash bin in his cell. He tied it carefully over his head, securing it tightly around his neck, and then he lay down on his bed and waited. By the time the guards found him during their next routine check, Larry Wu-Tai Chin was dead. The news of his suicide sent shockwaves through the intelligence community and the media. Some saw it as an admission of guilt, a final acknowledgement that he could not face the consequences of what he had done. Others saw it as an act of defiance, a refusal to spend the rest of his life as a symbol of betrayal, imprisoned and powerless. But those who had known Larry, colleagues, investigators, even some of the FBI agents who had arrested him, saw something else. They saw a man who had lived his entire adult life in a state of internal exile, a man who had never fully belonged to either nation he served, a man who believed until the very end that he had acted with honor, only to be told by both China and the United States that he had failed them. China never publicly acknowledged Larry as a hero. They did not honor him. They did not mourn him. They simply went silent, erasing his name from their records as if he had never existed. To Beijing, Larry had become a liability, an embarrassment, a symbol of failure. His usefulness had ended the moment he was exposed. The United States, of course, treated him as a traitor. His conviction was final. His name was added to the long list of Americans who had betrayed their country for foreign powers. In the official narrative, Larry Wu-Tai Chin was a criminal, nothing more. And so, in the end, Larry belonged to no one. Not to China, not to America, not even to himself. His family buried him quietly without ceremony in a small cemetery in suburban Virginia. There were no speeches, no eulogies, no flags or honors. Just a handful of mourners standing in the cold, trying to make sense of a life that had unraveled so completely. In the years that followed, intelligence analysts debated the true extent of the damage Larry had caused. Some argued that his espionage had been devastating, that he had given China strategic advantages that shaped the Cold War in Asia. Others believed the damage was limited, that Larry had passed mostly analytical material that China could have obtained through other means. But the real question was never about the documents. It was about the man. What does loyalty mean when you are caught between two nations? What is patriotism when your homeland is not the country you live in? And what is the price of living a life that can never be fully known, fully shared, or fully mourned? Larry Wu-Tai Chin spent 30 years inside the CIA. He spoke 2 languages, served 2 nations, and lived 2 lives. But in the end, he belonged to no one, not even himself. His story is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a story about the cost of divided loyalty, the weight of secrecy, and the impossible choices faced by those who live between 2 worlds. It is a story about a man who believed he was serving a higher cause, only to discover that both sides saw him as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. And it is a reminder that in the shadow wars of the Cold War, the greatest casualties were not always those who died on battlefields or in interrogation rooms. Sometimes the greatest casualties were those who survived, carrying secrets, carrying shame, carrying the unbearable loneliness of a life that could never be reconciled. Larry Wu-Tai Chin is gone now, but his story remains, a meditation on identity, conscience, and the cost of living in the shadows. And perhaps in the end, that is the only truth that matters.